This episode is dedicated to the memory of my wonderful, sweet little French bulldog, Lux Johnson, 2010 to 2022. We will always love you.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, the icon, the hologram graph, but I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus, but I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you riding with us here once again this week, where before we get to my guest who knows a lot about a lot, and he can tell us some of it, this is a top secret clearance type of gentleman. We'll get to that. I want to tell you about this exclusive club. I mentioned it. I've mentioned it on a few podcasts now. You can join this exclusive club for $5 a month or more at patreon.com/counterflow. $5 or more per month gets you into this oh so great and wonderful club where once a month we will do a Zoom call, myself and all of you who are $5 or more per month donors at patreon.com/counterflow. We can do Q&A. We can just have discussions on whatever is on y'all's mind. There's a good number of you guys emerging in this group. And so I'm looking forward to it. And from time to time, I think we'll have guests too. And this will only be via Zoom. It will not be a podcast episode. It will not be on the YouTube page. It will be our own private little talk group where we can say anything we want without getting kicked from anywhere. Well, I mean, I guess I could kick you guys from somewhere. It will be my group, but you understand what I'm saying. So join that. It's going to be fun. Let's get back to this guest here. Alex Braszko is the guest today. And not only is he what you would call a prepper, he's going to explain it a little bit better because I think that's one of those words you hear and something immediately comes to mind. Some of the time, it's probably correct. And for many of us, it's incorrect. And I'm not going to. Alex will explain what his version of being a prepper is, but he knows a lot about a lot. And he's a former military intelligence officer, space operations officer. He's a graduate from West Point. He had a top secret clearance. He did strategic level intelligence, as you will hear about. He was a chief innovations officer for the city of Kansas City, and now he's a military analyst for the Army. It is interesting because I know that he knows some things that he can't tell us. So it makes me think that what he can tell us and does tell us, you might want to listen to. Sometimes you can read between the lines with people like this, and the information he gives in this interview, I find quite valuable. Also, if you're watching this, and here's a little pitch for you to maybe watch this one. Of course, it's at YouTube on the YouTube channel. Just search Counterflow with Buck Johnson on YouTube and subscribe. He gives some really cool charts. We go through a PowerPoint on this episode. He knew that there's obviously an audio-only version of this show, so he does a decent job, I think, of explaining what we're looking at. But I do think it's pretty neat too. If you can go to the YouTube version and watch this, it's quite helpful. One of the interesting slides I found on here is that, let's see, how should I put this? And how much danger we might be if a nuclear attack were to occur. It's got some targets. And so it's got a whole map of the United States. And then it's got from those nuclear targets where the fallout zones would be. So we're going to go over that in this episode. And you can kind of see where do I live? I can tell you there are some areas that look, as you'll be able to see on this map, a lot safer than others. I'm a little worried here in Lockhart. We're very close to Austin, and it looks like I would be experiencing nuclear fallout, if they were to hit Austin. Anyway, I think that's a neat slide. And I think this whole interview, you're going to get a lot out of, and we'll jump to it right now. For the first time on Counterflow, my friend, Alex Braszko, welcome to the show, sir. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Buck?
I'm good. I usually give some people, I will have given you a proper intro prior, after we do this, but I kind of give them my own little intro to someone, but there's stuff about you. I'll just let you say it. I don't know what I'm allowed to say. And my audience will understand why shortly here, but give the audience a little intro on yourself.
Okay. So my name's Alex Braszko. I'm an Orthodox Christian. I'm a father. I'm a father of 5 in this world, and been married for about 22 years now to a beautiful woman who's also Orthodox. She's a convert, cradle Orthodox, and basically I've been spending a good portion of my life in the military environment. So went to military high school, was an Army brat growing up, and then ended up going to West Point for college, and ended up pursuing a career as a military intelligence and space operations officer. So about 22 years in the Army, active duty as a military intel and space ops officer. The majority of my time as a space ops officer was dealing with something called Integrated Joint Special Technical Operations, which basically involves special programs and special capabilities that we have. It's kind of behind the green doors is the way we refer to it. So I had a TS clearance my whole career. And then as a military intel officer, I also dealt with intel, and most of it was not tactical, it was more at the strategic level. So that's what I did in the Army for about 22 years. When I got out of the Army, I did a fellowship, and I ended up working in Kansas City, Missouri as the Chief Innovation Officer for Kansas City, Missouri. That was through an administrative change. So Mayor Sly James left, and then Mayor Quentin Lucas came in. And so I got to see 2 different mayors, and I learned a lot about politics, and it was a good experience. I was able to, I think, do a couple good things. One of them was create an emerging technology board for Kansas City, Missouri. It continues to meet, and here beginning of December, they're going to be having their winter retreat to basically talk about emerging technologies and the impacts in Kansas City, Missouri. So. And then I am currently now working as a military analyst for the Department of the Army. And so I've got to give the caveat and the disclaimer that anything I say is my own personal opinion. It's not the official opinion of the U.S. Army or any organization I've worked for in the past. And, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer. So that's my disclaimer. So I worked for a while as an analyst after leaving Kansas City, Missouri. Like I said, military analyst, and basically my focus was on smart city capabilities, but smart city capabilities from the Army's perspective, multi-domain operations, and then counter UAS, which I got to write the commander and staff guide counter UAS for the Army. It's on a restricted site, so you can't share it, unfortunately, but it's out there. My understanding is people are using it to get some utility out of it. So that's my professional background, a little bit about myself.
What is counter UAS?
So drones, unmanned aircraft systems, counter drone systems. Basically, everybody's got drones. They're ubiquitous now, right? Everybody's got they're racing drones. They're doing all kinds of cool things with drones. And as you're seeing in Ukraine right now, if you're on Twitter or if you're checking out what's happening in Ukraine, they're playing a significant role in Ukraine from a targeting perspective, from an ISR perspective, but also from a kinetic capability. They're dropping munitions, and there's a lot of video out there about how effective drones are in countering Russia, and then vice versa too. Both sides are using them very effectively. So the Army basically needed to start thinking about that, so I put that together for the Army.
Okay. Well, first of all, you said cradle Orthodox. So to jump back to that really quick, that's not totally common in the United States of America. How did that happen?
Well, so I'm a first generation American as far as being the first from my family born in the United States. My dad immigrated here. He was born in Rostov-Don. He's 100% Ukrainian. Last name is Braszko, but Americanized Braszko. And it's got the correct spelling. So if you know endings, it's Ukrainian. But my mom she was Russian and German, so kind of influenced by both. But I was baptized in Rockport Church in Howell, New Jersey. And I had spent most of my life in Howell, New Jersey, Lakewood, New Jersey, went to high school in Toms River, New Jersey, actually Pine Beach, New Jersey. So that's, I guess that's what I mean by cradle Orthodox.
Okay. So you know some things that we would all love to know, but some of the things you just can't say.
Yeah, no, you can't. And there is no need to get into the classified portions of things because there's plenty of information out in open source. So if I'm going to reference something today, it's going to be an example off of Twitter or book or any periodicals out there that are academic periodicals and accepted. So it's not going to. I won't reveal anything that I did in my career that would result in somebody going to jail, and family can't afford that. So no.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about also tell them about the book to soon be coming out. Yeah. I hope.
Yes. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it. So I've been an avid prepper for about 15 years. And it really started out in response to a natural disaster we had, which was the tail end of a tornado where we lived in Nebraska. And it hit our small town, actually, village. And basically, it caused a lot of damage. We were blessed. In the book, I kind of described the whole experience, but we were blessed to avoid any significant damage because trees happened to fall away from our house, which was a blessing. But I think we were without power for about 3 days or so. And I guess we had the forethought, thank God, to buy generators. So we didn't lose everything in our deep freezer, and we didn't lose everything in our refrigerator, and we were able to survive just fine because it was only a short duration. So, so that's where it started. But for 15 years, as I was focused on counterterrorism operations with the military, of course, because of my clearance level and the type of operations we were doing, I had access to classified information. And this wasn't too long after 9/11. So there were a lot of nefarious actors that were really trying to still mess with the United States, of course, as they do every day. But I had access to those intel reports. And that really kind of concerned me because at the time, when I was hearing what was potentially taking place, we lived in Alexandria, Virginia, and I worked at the Pentagon. So I realized that I could not, even though as the crow flew, I think it was about 4 miles from my house. It would very often, with traffic, take me an hour to get home after work.
Oh my God!
And maybe a little less if I took public transportation, which was the bus, walking to the bus stop, the bus, and then taking the metro to the Pentagon. But the bottom line was I did not feel comfortable with my wife and two very young children at home having to respond to a crisis if something happened. So, of course, did research, of course, learned about bugging out, of course, learned about bug out bags. And we had a plan. And we practiced the plan because if you don't practice, what's the point, right? Train as you fight, we see in the military. So, we had primary, secondary, tertiary meeting points. So that's when I started to really pay attention. But then, of course, having an understanding of what's taking place and how close some things were, I would get anxious. And so I kind of resolved then and there that I did not want to live in a heavily populated area. I wanted to live somewhere out in the country because everything I read seemed to be leaning towards that. And I started to, of course, talk to people that lived down in the country and knew some people who were pretty self-sufficient. So that seemed to be the solution. And after 15 years, I still think there are a lot of benefits to living out in the country from a self-sufficiency perspective and from a prepping perspective. So I see it as an advantage. So that's kind of the origins and the background. And like any prepper, I really kind of get caught up in the anxiety, which is kind of intentional sometimes, right? They want you to get spun up. When I say they, I mean people who either sell prepping products or people who are, prepping subject matter experts or self-defense subject matter experts. And so, it's pretty easy to get that way. But as I matured, as a Christian, as I matured as an adult, as an Orthodox Christian, and went through more difficulties in life, I started to realize, wait a minute, there's a whole aspect of this that's not being covered. That being the spiritual aspect of things, that being the emotional aspect of things, that being the mental aspect of prepping. So I really thought, these epiphanies I'm having, these insights I'm getting, And these best practices or lessons learned, I would really like to share them with somebody. So I thought it was about time to write a book. And well, about 2 years ago, COVID kicked off, right? And boy, was that not a wake up call, right? So, there were a lot of times I thank God we lived in the country and didn't have neighbors looking over our fence thinking we shouldn't be outside, doing whatever we're doing. I thank God that we lived in proximity to family and friends that had plenty of resources just in case we ran out of something. A lot of people did, right? So that was a blessing, but I still had a lot of difficulty with the mental aspects of what we experienced for 2 years, right? 2.5 years. And, of course, my job was threatened. I was not vaxxed. It's no secret, right? I had a medical exemption from my doctor for why I shouldn't get the vax. And then I also had a religious exemption that I suspended. But I'm not sure if you've interviewed people on your show or not, but there were a lot of people that had to deal with a lot of pressure and a lot of anxiety and the threat of losing their livelihood during those 2.5 years. So that in itself was a wake-up call, and it really forced me to focus on those other aspects of prepping that we didn't see. And then the final part of the book that I focus on is really the technological aspect that we need to be aware of as preppers, because I don't know of many preppers, even, Christian preppers. I don't know of many that talk about the dangers that come from your devices, and just how dangerous it is to be as reliant upon our devices as we are when it does come to either a man-made or a natural crisis. So the way things are heading, it's looking like, we're looking at these protests taking place in China right now for days, right? And our State Department's warning any American citizens to hunker down for 14 days, gather as much medication as you can, get yourself food, water, whatever supplies you need, and prepare to hunker down for 14 days because they're expecting the Chinese Communist Party to really crack down on all these people that are protesting, right? So anyway, yeah, that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Okay, there's a lot to go off of there. I want to talk about that smart device and your devices because, it seems more and more people kind of realize what's going on with maybe the cameras or the microphones, especially nowadays. Most people are aware that they'll be talking to a friend about some kind of product, and lo and behold, the next time they're on Instagram or Facebook, there's the ad. So it's almost hard to deny at that point. But yeah, there was a time when, this has been 2011 or so. An older friend of mine had tape over the camera on his computer, even back then when they still had they were probably early editions of cameras on computers, but he had tape over it and something on his TV as well. And I remember laughing, going, oh my goodness, come on. And I've been, into conspiracy type politics since, or 2000 or just before that. So I was aware I had heard that kind of thing. And I thought that's a little too far. There's no way someone's looking at you through this camera that I'm looking into right now, unless you turn it on and or hit record. So can you talk to us and educate us on, because you know about this stuff, talk about phones, computers, TVs, because I'm not aware of all of it yet either.
Yeah. So not to be an alarmist and not to be a Luddite, right? Because I work in technology and I've been working in technology my whole life. This thing, if the Chinese Communist Party does have it, if the Soviet Union had access to this, right, for 70 years, if the Nazis had access to this, boy, they would love to be able to use it for the Gestapo or the KGB, right? And we see right now from China, which is definitely a surveillance state, we see just how effectively they're using it in day to day, right? So it is a microphone. It is a camera on you for some people if they have it next to them at night, right? Carry around 24/7. It is a potential monitoring device, right? And so, what does that mean? I have nothing to worry about. I'm not doing anything bad. Well, I don't think the Freedom Truckers thought what they were doing was bad or illegal, but they were how did they determine who was there? Well, there were license plates on the trucks, obviously, right? But those individuals also had cell phones, and the cell phones were being interrogated by cell towers, and there's GPS, tracking mechanisms in their phone, and they also maybe used their devices to purchase things, and whether it was locally or not. I mean, all that data was used against them, and that's really the point. Is that we've come to a point in our world, in our history, where big data and Big Brother are very closely intertwined. And you're like, well, the government's not collecting on people because we have laws in place, we have USIDs in place, right? We have things in place that prevent that. Well, what it doesn't prevent is private corporations, big tech companies from collecting all that data, very often without your knowledge, even though you may click and submit to something, and then sharing that data with the U.S. government. So on January 6th, right, there were plenty of articles out there discussing the relationship between the government and these tech companies that collected data and were sharing it with the FBI to track down these individuals and where they were, whether they went into the Capitol or not, right? So, that's the Freedom Truckers, January 6th folks. In Ukraine, there's plenty of open source Twitter feeds saying that, and articles too, saying that generals are being targeted through use of their cell phones, right? Russian generals are being targeted, and they've lost quite a few. And even with that knowledge, it still continues to happen from what you see on Twitter. So it's just an understanding of what these things can you do to you, even if you think you're using an app like Signal, right? Or Telegram, and you think you're secure. Do you know who created those apps? Do you know what their intent was? Do you know, if you were to collect on someone doing some bad stuff, would you love to be able to herd them into a place where all the bad guys go to talk privately, right? So, and then of course we have AI, we have machine learning and AI. So where it used to be decades ago, the amount of intel that we would collect would just be astronomical and couldn't ever fathom doing analysis on it. We now have AI and machine learning. And so all that data that is collected, that's archived, because a lot of it was, even in Kansas City, right? Through public-private partnerships, sensors set up throughout the city, data collected on individuals. They weren't even aware of it, whether they're signing it into, free Sprint Wi-Fi or whatever it was. And all that data is collected and stored, and nobody knows where it goes. Nobody knows who's using it, right? Or how it's being used. So I think it's just important to be aware of what's taking place. And I explain in the book, and maybe we'll get to the slide here, but there will definitely be a time, and I think it's fast approaching, where people are going to have to make a decision how they're using their devices, that maybe they're more freely using it now, right? So there's simple solutions to things like Faraday bags, right? You go on Amazon, you buy a little phone bag, it's $20. It has RFID blocking material in it, and it, make sure it works, whatever you buy, right? Test it out, see if it works, see if it can receive a call or not. But, you can't rely on things like turning off your phone. You can't rely on airplane mode. You cannot rely on removing a battery, just because there's plenty of technical information out there you can read about, people that live, eat, and breathe this stuff, that will tell you you can still do things with your phone, even when all that's happening. So my point from a prepping perspective is, if one of the things we're prepping for is going to be maybe, persecution, as Christians say, right? Because a lot of people felt that in the past 2.5 years. A lot of people feel they're experiencing it now in the military. And I know quite a few folks personally that feel that way. You got to understand, you've got a computer in the middle of your kitchen or in the middle of your living room where everybody sits and talks. It's got a camera on it, and it's got a microphone on it, right? And God forbid, people are targeted for their religion in this country someday. But if that were to happen, you're really going to have to make a decision. How are you going to go on without making yourself so vulnerable? And what measures can you take? Maybe you move, your computer down to a, more private corner in your basement or guest room. Maybe you put your phone in an RFID bag if you don't want somebody to have access to you talking to someone about personal things, right? Because it's true, we've had the same thing happen. So is all our family. When you're talking about a health issue, next thing you know, you're getting an ad for that health product, whatever it is. So that would be my recommendation from a technology perspective. And like I mentioned that, I talked to a friend recently and said, I've got a picture of my family on the phone, right? So it looks like this good innocent thing, but maybe you make it seem less attractive. I mean, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out the best ways to do this, but maybe put a bloodshot red eye on it so that it reminds you it's not a beautiful, wonderful thing you're carrying around with you all the time, that it has some things that you're concerned about. Or, if you're so reliant on it, every contact you have in a crisis, if someone confiscated it and you need to contact someone, maybe do something as simple as write down all your contacts in an app, like the old school way, right? So there's things you can do. And I'm not advising everyone to go throw away their phone now. There's a smart C SME. He really is a SME. His name is Aman Jabi, and I met him recently and I spoke to him recently. But he has quite a bit of good information out on Facebook. And Aman is currently living in Montana. He lets that be known. And he goes and speaks to his local representatives. He speaks to congressmen, senators, municipal and county folks, and he informs them of his concern with all the data that's being collected, even in some remote towns, because through these public-private partnerships, these companies are putting these technologies into some of the most remote little towns, all in the name of security, safety, and convenience.
Right.
And there's no lie. It does give you a lot of convenience, and it sure does help local law enforcement sometimes. There's no doubt about it. I know people in Kansas City that were part of our emerging technology board that are just huge advocates for putting more and more and more sensors out there to make the police, KCPD's life easier. And God, I love them. They're awesome people, and I have all the respect in the world for them. And I have some good friends that are KCPD. But, at some point we have to be willing to limit things for our freedoms and liberties. And this guy, Ahmad Jabi, is really an advocate for that. So I would recommend if people want to know specific details about specific technologies, check out his stuff, because it's really worth your time.
I come from, I don't have a political label these days, but the world I come from was libertarianism. And one of my kind of personal heroes is still Ron Paul. And Dr. Paul, even before 9/11 really, but he has been warning Americans broadly, but certainly people on the right when he was running as a Republican in 2008 and 12. Look, I know you think this war on terror is a good thing, or, we're going to get those bad guys, but the tools we're giving the government can be used against you if you're not careful. And
Absolutely.
now, with the current environment, certainly since Trump took office and then, leading up to January 6th, post January 6th, all of this, it's starting to seem like Dr. Paul was right. Do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's awesome. I think Rand Paul, I think they got their heads on straight. I think they see a lot of things that people have not seen, or maybe just haven't had the courage to speak up to, even if they've seen it, especially recently, the past 2.5 years. And I applaud their efforts, and I think they're right on the money. I mean, it's just, some people say you're an alarmist, but it just blows my mind how much parents are willing to allow their children that haven't developed the maturity to handle those type of devices and what they mean, just have free reign with them, right? So like, that's alarmist, that's extremist. What are you going to do? Hide your kids from cell phones? Maybe for a little longer, right? Maybe until they're older. Maybe I gradually give them freedoms and opportunities to use them in my presence first, till I learn that I can trust them and that they're not doing something they shouldn't. Well, they're going to do it someday. Okay, when they leave my house, right? It's their responsibility. I've done my duty as a parent, but I feel an obligation. My wife feels an obligation to be very cautious with technology and the things that they can expose your kids to and bring them into.
Let's talk more about prepping, because it's interesting. I think when people hear that word, even the ones that are very much into it, sometimes have a different definition of what it is to them, right? It's almost, it shouldn't be subjective, maybe, but it seems that's what it is. So can you kind of give your version, like what is a prepper versus certainly what you don't think it is or what it shouldn't be considered?
Sure. So I'll ask you, if you don't mind, to bring up slide 2 from the deck I sent you.
Let's do it.
And
guys,
slide,
if y'all are listening and you're not watching, you're going to miss this slideshow for the first time.
Most people, because I listen to your podcast in the car, so I will try to be as descriptive as I can for the people in the car that are listening to this.
If you love coffee or someone in your life loves coffee, here is the thing to do. I've got an idea for you, as does my friend Stephen Fox over at Fox & Sons Coffee. Fans of Counterflow, use code BUCK25, BUCK25, for 25% off of your order of $25 or more now through the end of this year. Order by December 19th for delivery before Christmas. It's my favorite coffee. It's a wonderful business, really. This guy is so supportive of this show, Counterflow. So give him some business. He's got a wonderful family. Give this small business some money and you get some delicious coffee. And it's really cool. People are going to love it if you just order before December 19th. Give the gift of coffee. Wake people up, damn it. $1.25 for 25% off of your order. Order at foxndsons.com. That's FOXNSONS.com. Thank you, guys. Let's get back to the show.
Preparing for the day, really, is that, and it's slide 2.
Yep. Now, see, I've never done this before, audience. I got to figure out how to do this, how to get back to...
I know he can.
Yeah.
You hit escape, you might get out.
Oh, look at this.
Just, yep.
Yeah, there you go.
But keep going to 2.
There we go.
Yep.
Now.
So my premise for prepping for the day is that prepping in its popular secular form, what people are most familiar with, is not actually very good or healthy for you, right? Especially if you're a Christian and you're pursuing it, because it can often lead to that self-reliance, that inward focus, greed, obsession with resources and stuff, which takes a lot of time, money, energy away from your family, your friends, your community, whatever, other beneficial things you could be doing. And a lot of it's anxiety based, right? So, but Christian prepping, on the other hand, my premise is that conducted correctly, in accordance with Holy Scripture and Holy Tradition, is not only good, but actually should be encouraged, especially given the persecution of Christians in Western secular nations that we've seen recently, and that I truly believe we will see more of in the near future. Okay. And if you go to the next slide, 3, I think if you, yep. So what Christian prepping is not, like I said, is it's not living in fear and anxiety about what might come, whether it's natural or man-made disasters. It's not being greedy, okay, trying to buy every product that's promising to protect you for every given situation, right? Because if you start worrying about, one thing, you tend to think about the next thing, and then it tends to snowball. So, and it, there's a cost, like I said, a financial cost, a time cost. There's also a physical space cost for all the prepping stuff that you can easily collect. And so Christian prepping is not focusing on that. It's not watching all the apocalyptic zombie comet striking alien focused movies out there, right? Trying to keep yourself motivated. Because as silly as it sounds, I've heard a lot of quote Christian pastors that are supposed to be experts on prepping doing that, and I think it's really foolish, even in jest. Just anyway. Focusing your efforts on taking care of you and yours alone. It's not that, right? Because it's understanding that if there's going to be a situation where you really have to survive, you're going to have to do that as a member of a community. And hopefully you have a close-knit community, church community, doing that as a Christian. It's also not responding to a crisis as the Alamo man, to where it's you and your family hunkering down or bugging out, and anybody that gets in your way or asks you for something poses a threat, and any threats are going to be, eliminated with a bullet between the eyes. That's not what it is. But then at the same time, Christian prepping is not every Christian's calling. Okay. So I'm not trying to make an argument to people who don't feel it's something that they need to or should do. Okay. I think that God provides for everyone, and He has a plan for everyone. Right. And my whole premise in the book, I get into it. I could spend easily an hour about biblical references that I use in the book that point to specific examples where it's encouraged to prep. It's encouraged, whether it's Joseph in Egypt preparing for a 7-year plague, or whether it's Elijah, right? How God took care of him in the crisis when he had to run away to escape for a while. Whether it's reference to ants and grasshoppers and how you're supposed to be prepared like one and not foolish like the other. So there's plenty of examples. And then of course, because it's biblical arguments, people are going to pull out quotes to say, we're not supposed to worry about those things. But yeah, I'm saying you're not supposed to worry about those things. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do those things, right? All things are permissible for me, but not all things are good for me, right? So anyway, I get into depth in the scripture, and we could spend a good amount of time on that, but I think there's plenty of basis for that. But Christian prepping is first and foremost Christ-centered, okay? It's prepping according to God's commandments and the biblical examples that we see, okay? It's trusting in God that whatever the situation is going to provide for you, your family, your community, and that sometimes that's going to be a lot less than you think, right? And sometimes it might not be as abundant as far as what you think you need, but somehow you'll survive. There's plenty of examples, historical examples, where people have been persecuted either politically or religiously, to where people have somehow survived either on a potato share between a family of 5 or, a small piece of bread here or there. So it's trusting in God. Very important. It's responding in love in all situations, right? Some of the advice you hear consistently is you can't trust other people with your stuff. You can't reveal that you have access to stuff in a crisis because people will come looking for it. Well, what are you going to do as a Christian if a mother and a child comes to your house and is starving? They're starving and they ask you for food. Are you going to deny them anything that you have and say, I'm sorry, move on, or you're going to get a bullet in between your eyes, right? Or are you going to say, okay, maybe I need to share. But then it's also my next point, being as clever as a serpent and innocent as a dove, right? Maybe you don't invite somebody into the fold. Maybe you don't invite them into your house to see what your security posture is. Maybe you don't give them a 5-gallon bucket of grain, okay? Maybe you give them small hand foods of grain for themselves and their child. And maybe you geographically separate them to a position that you have oversight of, right? So you just have to be cautious of that because there are threats. People are right. If you were in a prepping situation and you have, and there's that don't have, a lot of people will be looking to take what you have, right? So you have to be aware of that. And like I said, clever as a serpent, innocent as a dove. But there's things you can do to mitigate it to an extent. So looking at the lives of the saints, martyrs, and for us as Orthodox Christians and Catholics have it as well, monastics and monasteries. They have some great examples historically, whether it's Mount Athos, or Meteora in Greece. Okay, there's a lot of good examples where monasteries have specifically been built to withstand invasion from whatever invading armies it was, right? Or barbarians or whatever it was. And the physical precautions that they take and the measures they took actually help them to survive and allow the faith to continue to an extent, of course, all by God's grace. But, practical things sometimes are practical, right? Finally, I have that Christian prepping is remembering that no matter how overwhelming the adversary or adversity looks, right, our God's an awesome God and he overcomes all. And I'll speak to that a little bit later in the next few slides. But if you can go to the next slide, Buck.
Mm-hmm.
So Christian prepping is also spiritual growth, okay? The actual preparation that you do as a Christian to prepare yourself for a potential crisis could hopefully, if you're doing it right, and prayer, fasting, everything you should be doing as a Christian in the first place, including with this activity, hopefully it can lead to spiritual growth. Because it's not just material preparation for a crisis, but prepping your body, your mind, your heart, your soul, right? And it's my model, my recommendation is not so much a resource model, more of a faith model, if you want to look at it, maybe potentially as a parish model. It's not a monastic model, right? Because we have monasteries doing that, and we've had other good people write good books about that. But it does emphasize the importance of a community, specifically a community built around a church and a parish. So learning to be selfless to others is hard for a lot of people, right? Especially the way we live in this country, and focusing on others versus themselves can be a challenge. Using your God-given talents to help others during a crisis, even when it's hard, that could be a really good opportunity for you to grow spiritually. Interacting, sharing a skill set or a piece of equipment with others in a community. A lot of times we buy something and we take pride. That's mine. That's my baby. It hasn't gotten a scratch on it. I maintain it perfectly. Well, maybe you have to share it with somebody else who needs it. Maybe they don't baby it the way you do. How are you going to respond to that? It's only a thing, right? So what's your response going to be? There's another opportunity for growth. And just basically understanding the importance and necessity of communities living in proximity to each other. We learned during COVID lockdowns that it's a really impractical concept to think that you're going to be living alone and doing very well, right? It's extremely hard, even over the course of just a couple of weeks. So that has to be recognized and acknowledged as well. But basically, it's living our lives as Christians should be living them in the first place. But as preppers, intentionally taking measures to prepare yourself, your loved ones, your community, ahead of time to mitigate a crisis, including what I said before, the very real persecution of Christians, which is oftentimes facilitated through our devices, right? Mm-hmm. And will be, I'm almost certain. So that's it. If you want to go to the next slide.
And really quick, you made a quick point there that I hear this a lot with people that kind of claim to be preppers or homesteaders, but you'll hear sometimes, when the stuff hits the fan, I'm good. Me and my wife or whatever, we're just going to go and live in the middle of nowhere. We won't be around anyone.
Yeah.
And that's always felt unrealistic to me. What are your thoughts on that?
So if you read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, right? If you've read that book, there's actually a reference to it where there was a group of old Orthodox believers that did that successfully. Like they saw the writing on the wall, and they went out into the Russian taiga and they actually developed communities that were very self-sufficient. They did trade. They did it very clandestinely. They sent individuals kind of secretly through the woods alone, making sure nobody was following them to go out maybe to a small community and purchase some goods that they might not have and to bring it back quietly. But there just happened to be a Soviet pilot flying overhead one day, and he sees this, village. He's like, "What is this thing? What is going on here?" Right? And so the communists actually planned efforts to go and to take over that village, and they did. They rounded people up, they shot people, they sent them off into camps, and it's like, well, what was the point? Well, they got an extra 10 to 20 years, whatever it was, right? Of life not under the yoke. But ultimately, like I said, going back to what we talked about before, understanding that God has a plan and a purpose for you. And maybe it's not to survive the way you did. Maybe it is to become a martyr, right? But that sort of thing taking place there is guaranteed today and in the near future, given the unclassified information you can find out about overhead capabilities from satellites, right? In low Earth orbit, comm satellites, right, that are collecting your digital identity, which is being developed as we speak, right, in the future, to where you won't be able to trade unless you have an identity. And people, if they do trade with you, will be risking their own freedom, if not their life, right? So, I mean, me versus the world, again, is not very practical. I don't believe. You might survive for a while. You might do okay on your own, but inevitably, people get hurt. Inevitably, people need help on things. And so, I would say that's not my recommended way to go about doing things. Doesn't mean that maybe living in a community that's well integrated, let's say maybe with a monastery nearby and with another local community that even if it's secular, maybe they're good folks, and maybe they have a shared relationship with you that you develop now ahead of time, that would help you survive in a crisis to maybe where you could barter. Maybe that's a more effective way of going about trying to survive if there were a crisis to that extent.
All right, cool. Let's hit that next slide. You ready?
So the next slide is just something that I pulled up off of online, right?
Yeah.
And what it talks about is the likelihood and the impact of incidents taking place, the likelihood versus the impact. So the concept here is basically it's kind of like a risk assessment, right? If 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 a crisis is almost certain to happen, and the impact to you and your family or community is catastrophic, maybe that's really something you should focus on there in the top right corner, right? Critical red, right? But if something is rarely going to happen, if happen at all, and the significant impact to you, your family, or community is very, very low, maybe you shouldn't waste your time on it, right? So I don't know. Let's give an example. Comet hitting Earth, right? What are the chances of that? It's happened in the past. Okay. Is it going to happen again? I pray not. As Christians, we don't see any of that taking place, right? Not scripturally, right? So what does it mean? Well, maybe that's rare. What's the impact of it? It's catastrophic if it happens. Okay. So how much effort am I going to put into it? Maybe a moderate amount if I'm going to do that, right? What I have to do is compare it to other crises. And then again, the time, the resource, the money, the energy that I have to exert towards it. So understanding the risks and understanding how likely they are to happen and what the potential impact is helps you as a prepper not to try to prep for everything, which is a very common thing that people want to do when they start doing it. So the next, can we do a little experiment here?
Yeah, this one's kind of scary.
There you go. That's kind of what I was hoping you to say eventually. You said it right up front. So, so what do you see, Buck? What's this in front of you?
Well, for me, I see a civilian target for a nuclear attack about 30 minutes from my house. I'm in Lockhart, Texas, and about half an hour from Austin. So that's what I see first.
This is a great graphic that, to my understanding, was developed. It's there who did it, but it was in coordination with FEMA, and basically talks about civilian targets, military targets, infrastructure targets, and yeah, there's a bunch of them, especially around those populated areas, right? But then there's targets in places that people don't even think about, like Lake City Arsenal here in Independence, Missouri. How many people know that the number one of the largest manufacturers of 5.56 and 223 ammo, is at the Lake City Arsenal? Even people that live here don't necessarily know that. So that might be one of those potential military targets that's on the graphic for Kansas City, right? So yeah, but the point is, you start looking at it and you start analyzing. You're like, okay, then there's places where there would be wildfires if there was a nuclear attack, and then there's places where there's severe fallout in close proximity to the initial impact sites, followed by medium fallout, minor fallout to minimal fallout, to where you really don't even have to worry about it so much, right? Because no shelter is required. Some of them you have to shelter for 2 to 7 days or 3 weeks, and then you just start thinking. See what's happening here? You start thinking. You start, where am I? Well, there I am. Oh, I'm not in the white. I'm in the purple. What does that mean? That means I have to shelter for 3 to 7 days. And you just start getting into this snowball effect, to where you start really thinking, worrying, right? So the point of prepping from an Orthodox or from a Christian perspective, and also especially an Orthodox perspective, the right way to think, right? And to believe things is, okay, this is what somebody is telling me could potentially happen. Not guaranteed to happen. God works in mysterious ways. Maybe this is something I need to take into consideration. What's the likelihood that there's going to be a full-scale strategic attack on the United States by an adversary? Don't know. Hopefully it's not going to happen. How much do I have to prepare? Well, let's see. You can do some research if you want. Your fallout shelter is going to cost between $2,000 to $10,000. I think that's the average cost. And if you're going to be using it for, 3 weeks, is it worth your time and money to use your basement, maybe instead of your building a fallout shelter in your backyard? Maybe it's good enough. Maybe you're close enough, and would be able to survive fairly well without really having to go full out, and get carried away by stuff like that, right? So that's why I brought that up. The next slide, I'll describe it to the readers. Basically, I'm going to give credit to a really devout Catholic prepper, a mother, a wife, former captain in the Army, Emily Rainey. She appeared on a podcast. I think it was TCE 27 and the Catholic Experience or something like that. And I happened to be listening to her one day. And she was talking about a model for how we're supposed to prep. And she was referring to concentric circles of opportunity. And because it was a podcast, she's just talking. There was no visual graphic, but I could imagine it in my mind. And so, giving credit to her, she has 4 circles. Okay. And right now, the circles where most of us are at have the center core circle being a yellow, and then progressing out to a deeper, darker green at the very edge. Well, so what are these concentric circles? At your core, you have those things that are essential to you as a Christian, including your faith, right? Your relationship with others, right? Maybe your spiritual health, your mental health, right? Those core essentials that you really can't function with, okay? The next she has, that she referred to, I believe, as intangibles, right? So those things you can't touch, but that are priceless in a crisis. That's your skill sets, right? Your ability to cope with things, your knowledge of things and the world around you, and how to adapt to those things around you. And from a prepping perspective or homesteading perspective, being self-sufficient and understanding what goes into that, those are some of your intangibles, right? The next circle out, she's got tangibles, and that's a little bit greener because preppers are pretty comfortable, or at least they get comfortable saying, okay, I need so many calories per day. I need dry goods. I need something that's going to store longer. And they will begin to understand the difference between canned goods and dried grains and legumes. And, they do the cost benefit analysis of where they're going to invest the money. All those things are tangibles in that third circle out from the center. And that's something people are comfortable with, which is why it's greener, right? And then the outside, the non-essentials, the things we've been doing day to day, especially pre-COVID, are those things that take up a lot of our time and could maybe distract us from the core essential things we should be focusing on as Christians. And that's your silly things. That's your being distracted, maybe binge watching TV, right, for days and weeks. And maybe it's your addictions, right? Maybe it's allowing yourself to just constantly being in a state of stupor with drugs and alcohol, or it's just it's those things that we do that we take a lot of comfort in, especially being a Western country and having access to those type of luxuries. When in fact, right, the circle on the right, you'll notice it has 3 circles, right? It doesn't have a 4th circle. That 4th circle of non-essentials drops off. And your core should really be your deepest, darkest green. And that's where you need to be focusing your efforts, followed by the intangibles, followed by the tangibles. So that's kind of where we need to be as Christian preppers. That's refining a little bit, I think, of what her model is, but that's what she developed. I like concentric circles of opportunity. She corrected me when I thought it was something else. But if you go to the next slide, and I spoke to her about this, and I think she's on board with it as far as mentioning she liked it, would be putting it into a phased timeline, right? Why? It's because I'm a military guy, and if you're doing strategies or if you're doing con-ops, you need a phased timeline. But from a practical perspective, it's, okay, where were we? Well, that yellow-centered, progressing to dark green, concentric circles of opportunities. Personally, I like to think that it was prior to 2020, right? Prior to March 13, 2020, when a pandemic was declared, okay?
Mm-hmm.
I have a red arrow on this graphic showing that we're kind of in this preparatory stage. And hopefully during this preparatory stage, whatever it is, a couple years, couple months, maybe a couple decades, whatever it is, we're preparing potentially for a crisis, especially as Christians, understanding that people are predicting statistically, I think by 2070, I read a study that 30% of the U.S. population is going to claim to be Christians, right? Understanding that during COVID, a lot of people that were Christians, you kind of saw what their true colors were during COVID, right? We don't know what that preparatory time is going to be, but hopefully we have some time to do some prepping to get us to a place where we're much darker green, maybe with 3 concentric circles instead of 4, right? I put on this timeline a dashed line followed by a solid line, and I refer to that as the quiet time. To me, that is the time where you have to really understand what it's going to need to have a digital currency. Just like we saw in certain cities like Washington, D.C., if you were unvaccinated, you could not go to a restaurant. You could not go into stores. You could not purchase things unless you comply, right? And so that's not far-fetched. All you have to do is look at what took place in New Zealand during the past 2.5 years, Australia, Canada, and China to understand just how much technology is going to be involved in contact tracing or maybe religion tracing or whatever it is. So we're going to have to sacrifice our devices and do something to control them much better during that quiet time, if not just altogether get rid of them. Okay. And then depending where you are, depending on the situation, if you need to move, right, move out, bug out in prepper terms instead of hunkering down, that's something you may have to take into consideration too. Because even if you've got here's reality, right? You got your prepping home, your land in place. You've got your bunkers. You've got your fighting positions dug in. You've got your range fans laid out. You are ready to go if the crap hits the fan. And then maybe there's a call up, right? Maybe there's a involuntary draft to get people to go to war if it's against that pure right country. Or, hey, maybe you can no longer, given the new digital identity, afford to pay your taxes. Maybe your land is repossessed, right? So you have to have a secondary and even maybe a tertiary plan for what you might do. Okay. And maybe that's go to a monastery, or maybe it's go to a different community that's not facing the same sort of difficulties that you're facing. So hopefully all of it going to that end state where you've got your dark green, most important circles, dark green, and you're thriving. And I don't know if you've done much reading, but there are predictions within our church by some of our saints, St. Paisius, St. Ephraim, St. Basil, I believe, to where it's talked about the difficult time. And I'll just say up front, Orthodox Christians, we don't ascribe to the rapture, right? That a lot of our Protestant friends look to be the solution. And there is a good book, and I would recommend it if people are interested. It's A Rehearsed War, Christ's Millennial Reign and the Rapture of His Church by Dennis Eugene Engelman. We bought it at our church bookstore. And I would encourage even Protestants to read that, to consider where the origins of the concept of a rapture come up, when those concepts were developed. And, I'm not trying to be contentious. I got a lot of Protestant friends I love who adamantly believe that they don't have to worry about any of this because Christ is not going to allow his people to suffer. I just can't see anything biblically that says Christ won't allow his people to suffer. Okay. I mean, he protects us. He saves us. He saves our soul, which is ultimately the most important thing. He's our salvation and our hope. And that doesn't change even if we're in the midst of tribulation or facing persecution or dying a martyr's death. So I just think that it might be a good idea, since no one knows the time, right? No one knows the place and time. But a few of our saints are predicting, I think it's about 3.5 years, if there is going to be a time of persecution that's very, very difficult for us for reasons beyond my understanding. That's about the time frame that's given. So it's like, so what are you saying, Alex? Do I buy 3.5 years of dried food? No, I'm not saying that, because if you can fit 3.5 years of dried food in your house, you're probably going to look a little weird to folks that come over. And good luck face for it. And what are you going to use, right? So the point is, maybe it's more of an understanding of maybe now's the time to develop my skill, right? Maybe now's the time to go get a simple book like the one that I have. And I don't like to advocate for products. There's certain products I really believe in, but books I do like to talk about because I've read too many of them from a prepping perspective. So like Seymour has The Self-Sufficient Life and How to Live It, right? These books that tell you everything in a concise volume, like how to take care of chickens, but then it also tells you how to take care of a garden, and it also tells you how to prune a tree, and it also tells you maybe how to treat some basic diseases, garden and orchard diseases, with maybe things that you have on hand instead of having to go to a store and buy them. And so those books are great because you can kind of peruse them if you're thinking about prepping and saying, okay, which of these things pique my interest? Which one of them do I feel I have a talent in? Which one of them would I like to learn? And then maybe share with my local community, right? I think that's much more practical for everybody beyond yourself, and maybe doing more than one, right? Maybe having a few skills is much more practical for yourself, your community, your family, than trying to store up 3.5 years of dry food, right? So the process and the means to have those things distributed amongst the community is kind of great for risk mitigation to an extent, but I just think spiritually it's better for us. So those really the slides that I wanted to talk about. I have a couple others here that are icons that we can talk about as we go along. But I'll open it up to you, Buck, if that raised any concerns or questions or anything.
You mentioned something during that kind of piqued my interest on what your thoughts would be. You said, I think you actually specifically said Christians, some of them showed their true colors during COVID. But I would broaden it even to just society at large. Many people showed their true colors. Were you surprised about some of those things, or what were your insights, or what did you think of that?
I think a lot of us naively think, because I live in a part of the country where there's a large, predominantly probably Christian portion of the country, right, living around me. And if they're not sincere in their faith, at least they would openly tell people that they're Christians, right? So I think it was a shock to people how quickly our freedoms disappeared and were even trampled on during the past 2.5 years. And I'm speaking from personal experience, right? Like, if you chose to not do certain things, you paid the price. And it wasn't just ridicule. I mean, it was threats to your livelihood, if not physical threats to physical violence from people in public places to, nobody was coming to your house and knocking down the doors, thank God. But if you were a freedom trucker, you kind of were experiencing that, right? People were knocking down your truck doors. They were dragging you out. They were dragging you away to prisons, right? And a lot of those people thought they were doing nothing more than protesting and expressing their displeasure with a soft totalitarian regime, which is what Trudeau and his crew were, right? So I think that was the surprise to a lot of American Christians in these predominantly Christian communities, and is that, oh my gosh, even though we're America, our freedoms and rights, our constitutional rights, might be trampled by people inside our country, right? We swear to uphold and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, was the domestic threat as much from people protesting in the streets? Sometimes it was, because there was violence, right? Or was the threat emanating and coming from our government working in close collaboration with tech companies? Yeah, I would say sometimes it was, right? So I think that's when I say people were showing their true colors in our country. I think it was like an epiphany, like, oh, wow, all those horrible things you happening about in, an advanced Western Europe right before World War II kicks off, right? Mm-hmm. What stops that from happening here, right? Mm-hmm. What stops that from happening here? So I think that's something we can't naively assume that we're protected from all that, and history doesn't impact us in the United States. But we were living Kush. I mean, we were living Kush the 80s, the 90s, unless you were in the military or maybe hit by 9/11, personally, most people, I think, were oblivious and kind of looked unhappy, all of us, with respect to how quickly the life as we know it can change. Right?
Yeah. I've heard what happened. I got to be careful how I say this. I've heard people say the measures that took place during 2020 and 2021 were a sort of test run, and that something will be coming down at some point again in a similar nature?
I read the Brownstone Institute. The name of the priest right now escapes me, but there was
Father John Downey.
That's him.
He will be on this show very, very soon.
Oh, well, awesome. Boy, that's awesome. Good job getting him on. That man has written a couple articles that tell it like it is, and in love, right? And so people made mistakes the past 2.5 years. This fear has a funny way of making people do those sort of things, right? Anxiety and automatic compliance and no examination of what's taking place intentionally because it's just easier not to, right? Or doing certain things out of convenience or wanting to assure you have access to things because you just can't imagine losing them, right? That's what happened. COVID and everything the past 2.5 years, in my personal opinion, has been that dress rehearsal, that dry run, that would be a big indicator for what would likely happen in the next pandemic or for, possibility of persecution of certain groups in our society. It was really sad. But like that, like Father said there, in his articles, I mean, it's also an opportunity to repent, right? So if we're Christians and if we went about things the wrong way out of fear, anxiety, or selfishness, doesn't mean we can't repent. And I think there's been a lot of people that have done that since, even if they're not Christian, right? I think a lot of people have been realizing that's to the benefit of everyone, not to try to deny those things happen, but actually to learn from them and grow from them, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, there was that, I did an episode on that article that was out in the Atlantic with, her name's escaping me. I did a whole episode discussing her, but she was Emily Oster.
That's it, Emily Oster.
Emily Oster was asking for, at first, forgiveness and amnesty. She switched the subtitle after she realized that wasn't going to apparently happen. What were your thoughts on that topic?
Oh, I think it was a convenient way to try to sweep under the rug things that people did to not hold them accountable for what they actually did, right? Which was treat people with contempt and to really treat people who maybe had a brain of their own, right? And maybe were using critical reasoning to try to understand what was taking place. Or maybe they were fighting for their constitutional rights, right? Trying to preserve, the preservation of all of our constitutional rights. I think she just wanted to ignore that, kind of like a kid does something bad and kind of hopes they can get away with it. That's kind of how I looked at that article when I read it.
Were there aspects of 2020 and 2021 that you look back upon, or maybe even during it as it happened, and see spiritual warfare?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not done, right?
No.
It's done. To be fair to those people who are still facing persecution, whose request for amnesty or their request to be able to not have to do something because of their religious convictions, and who are still being ignored, because that's still taking place. And shame on the senior leaders that are in positions that could be doing something to mitigate that, right? And I guess I'm talking specifically about my military brethren, who are some of the best officers I've ever met. And at this time in our nation's history, with what's going on in Ukraine and with what potentially might be going on in Taiwan, to ignore them, to cast them off, and not try to embrace them for the awesome military officers and leaders that they are, that's a shame. That's a real shame. It's not done. It's not over yet.
Is there a level of optimism in the short term that you have? All Orthodox, so maybe all Christians in general, have a long-term optimism. But what about short term?
Yeah, so I'll ask you to go to the next slide. I think it's if you don't mind, Buff.
My good friend Mark Clare, formerly of Lions of Liberty, you know him. You love that voice. You love his interview style because, well, he's damn good at it. he's got a new show we got to tell you about. It is called none other than The Mark Claire Show. And I've listened to every episode of it so far, and I love it. It's very good. Mark's interview style is spectacular, let's put it that way. But I like it because this new show goes much further than just discussing politics like he used to do. He's trying to go further, like I said, maybe getting into spirituality, religion, entrepreneurship, things that will help you guys better understand and navigate this crazy world. He does some conspiracy stuff on there, which I really like. He wants to help you guys diffuse propaganda. Now that in itself is a very tough task, but he can do it because he's got guests like Sam Tripoli. I just listened to that episode today. Absolutely loved it. He's got guests like friend of this show, Charlie Robinson. He's got guests like another amazing friend of this show, Father Turbo Qualls. And when Father Turbo's on a show, it's a must listen. You just know it is. So find The Mark Claire Show on Rockfin, Patreon. He's got a Telegram channel. He's got all of it. He's got a YouTube channel. And of course, it's on every podcatcher, Apple Podcast, Spotify, anything that you're listening to this show on. If you type in The Mark Claire Show, you can listen to this excellent new show. And I highly recommend that you do. I do. I love it. And a quick heads up, the spelling of Mark Claire's name is Mark with a C and Claire without an E. MarkClair. The Mark Claire Show. Go find it.
I wanted to pull up a couple icons I'm hoping to include in my book. And, I know there's things considered. Can you go back one?
Oh,
actually, two.
How do I do that? Hold on.
Here, up and down arrow keys. That might.
Aha.
Keep going. Yep, right there. So these are, a couple icons we have in our home. And they really helped me during COVID to remember things like the faith of the centurion, right? And that's Matthew 8, verses 5-9. Or, in Kings, you have Elijah being rescued from persecution and being fed in a cave by a raven, right? Where he heard God's voice in a whisper in the wind, right? And there's a pond there, or not a pond, a stream, sorry. And, he's being fed by the raven and he's getting water from the stream. And then God decides that stream needs to stop flowing in order to force him to move, right? And so he's not sitting there hunkering down like a prepper for good, relying on that raven, right? It's like God's got other plans for you. And then it's also important to know he's being fed by a raven, okay? That's not a 5-gallon bucket of dried legumes, okay?
Right.
That's a raven bringing little pieces of food, probably periodically. And through God's grace and by God's will, he's surviving, right? So that really had an impact on me, and something I try to speak about when I talk about prepping, because I think it's that important. And then the next, if you can go to the next one, this whole Christ washing Peter's feet icon, it reminds me that in a crisis, again, we're going to have to help people in a crisis. And really, that should be the focus of our efforts, others, not ourselves, not worrying about ourselves and living in fear and anxiety, but really focusing on others, which we should be doing anyway, Buck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which we should be doing anyway. So I like to bring up that icon. The next one is that realization that we may be martyrs one day, right? Like this is the icon of the Holy 40 Martyrs of Sebaste. And they were Roman soldiers, 40 of them. About 320 AD in what is today modern day Turkey. And we have a feast in the Orthodox Church, the Feast of the Holy Martyrs. And a little tidbit, I guess it's older than St. Basil. But anyway, that's how far back things go in our faith, right? So according to St. Basil, this is off of OrthoWiki, 40 soldiers openly confess themselves Christians, okay? How hard would that be to do? The past 2.5 years really helped us to realize how hard it would be to stand up and say, I'm a Christian, right? And face the wrath of people, especially if it were something that would result in death, not just for us, but for our families, right? How many people would be willing to do that? Well, here we've got the example of 40 of them, right? They were condemned by the prefect to be exposed naked upon a frozen pond near Sebasta on a bitterly cold night, that they might freeze to death. So that's a slow, gruesome death, right? It sucks. Among the confessors, one yielded. He left his companions. He sought the warm baths near the lake, which had been prepared for any who might prove inconstant. So if you renounced your faith, you could go to the warm bath, right? One of the guards set to keep watch over the martyrs beheld a supernatural brilliance overshadowing them, and at once proclaimed himself a Christian. He threw off his garments, which you can see in the icon, right? And proclaimed himself a Christian. So, he placed himself beside the 39 soldiers of Christ, and that got back to the number 40. But at daybreak, the stiffened bodies of the confessors, which still showed signs of life, were burned, and the charred bones were cast in the river. So Christians couldn't gather them up to be relics, but they did it anyway. So, and this church is built on those relics. So that's just another reality, right? That's the reality that I think we had to really consider. Like, okay, I'm going to stand up for my faith. Okay, you may lose your job. Okay, then what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to have to find a way to provide for my family. Well, how am I going to do that? I don't know, right? So it's very difficult. It sounds great when everything's going great to say, I would do this and I would definitely, guys, right? But when you think about the cold hard facts, it makes you pause and wonder if you really had the intestinal fortitude and the strength, the spiritual strength to do it. And what we might not be able to do, we can do through Christ, right? Because what's impossible, possible for Christ. So hopefully we would be in that position as Christians. And then the next one, so this is a secret school painting, Nicholas Gizis, I think is how you pronounce it. And it was, what it shows is young boys who were escorted under Turkish occupation to monasteries, to priests, and they learned about their faith. They learned about their traditions. They learned about their church, and that kept their faith, their church alive. And you might not be able to see it well, but if there's a good light on the painting, you'll see a soldier in the background, basically a Greek, right? Someone with a rifle sitting there also listening to what's taking place, protecting those children and the monk there. So, just another thing for your consideration that, if we face persecution, it's not going to be the first time. Well, no kidding, right? 300 years of persecution in the early church, plenty of examples under communism, plenty of examples where Nazis did the same thing. So even in modern history, so it's good chance it's going to happen again, right? So, and then the next slide, if you don't mind. I want to show the next slide, which even though it's the last slide in this presentation.
I love this.
So I pulled this up because it's got a little bit of a story to it. So at the height of COVID, right, when everything was uncertain and we're just, pulling our hair out, whatever's left of it, trying to understand how we could possibly be where we are as a country, right? We were fortunate. Our parish continued to have liturgy, throughout the crisis, and that has a lot to do with our leadership. And thank God we had bishops and Father Turbo that allowed us to do that in the church. And that's not a secret, right? And so, like I said, you kind of saw people's true colors. You kind of know who you can trust, maybe from a spiritual leader perspective, based upon how they acted during that real persecution. That was probably the most real persecution we faced in our country at that time, right? And by God's grace, we were able to find St. Mary of Egypt Orthodox Church and Father Turbo. And I said, Father, I've got all these icons and I love them. And they're helpful to me to remind me, just give me something to gaze at, kind of just think about and just focus on instead of reading all this social media. And I can read books, but man, it gets heavy when you start reading heavy books in a heavy time, right? So I need something to remind me that my God's an awesome God. And that all these sons of guns that are doing all these evil things, really, because that's what a lot of leaders were doing, evil things, ignoring their consciences, ignoring their faith, and persecuting people and preventing people from worshiping their God, right? I need something to remind me that those people are going to face God's wrath one day and that he will be victorious and that they will face the repercussions for what they did if they don't repent. And his response was pretty much, Alex, have I got an icon for you, kind of, to where he had been thinking about that himself, I think, for a while. So he was kind enough to write this icon. And I find it very helpful, especially in a time of crisis, to be reminded that we have a powerful God, right? We have an awesome God, and he controls everything. And so that's why I did that. So I want to show that. The slide before Buck is kind of the final conclusions when we get towards the end here of what I wanted to bring up for the group that's hopefully beneficial to them. Do you want me to go ahead and cover that?
Yeah, you can go ahead. Yeah, let's hit that one.
All right. So in the Army, right, work for the Center for Army Lessons Learned in the Past, and AARs is a standard thing that we do after every exercise or operation in the Army, because you don't want to repeat mistakes, right? You want to hopefully learn from the experiences you've had. And, I noticed that this Thanksgiving, not many people wanted to talk about what just took place over the past 2.5 years, but I think this was really the first Thanksgiving where we had a lot of that weight lifted off of us. And I think, the spectrum varies, but a lot of people just want to forget what took place, hope it never happens again. They may justify it as necessary. They may, excuse the people that made the poor decisions that they did, and they just hope it's done, and they want nothing to think of it, right? And then there's other people who want to bring it up and live it every day in anger and frustrations, and we can't do that, right? So my recommendation is, if you have not as a community, have a honest AAR, an after action review, okay? Talk about what took place. Talk about why things took place over the past 2.5 years. And whether you're a priest, maybe you're a priest that repented, or maybe you're a family member that let things get you carried away, have an honest, frank discussion and say, okay, this is what caused these to happen. If this were to happen again, what are we going to improve upon, right? What mistakes are we not going to repeat? Or, when I did this with my own family, one of them that I acknowledged was being overwhelmed by social media. I'm looking, right, constantly during the past 2.5 years. I was looking, especially in the beginning, for any signs of sanity, right? Any voice in the wilderness that was saying something that was good and true and right from a healthcare perspective, from a scientific perspective, a medical perspective, a constitutional perspective. I was looking for that, right? And it's built up this anxiety and anger to where it became an obsession. And yes, my job was at risk. Yes, we couldn't go do the things we were planning to do. Yes, we had to cancel a lot of stuff. But my AAR, point that we brought up was, don't do that again next time. Okay, so intentionally put away the phone. Intentionally don't sit on social media, even though you want to know everything that's happening, the last thing that's transpired that may help you or hurt you. So I would recommend that. Next thing is to understand that the efforts, and I think I hope you can have them on your talk show. I don't know if you'll be able to do that, but hopefully have a discussion, maybe with a panel of subject matter experts, about understanding what smart city initiatives, what digital identity is, what the social credit score equivalent that we see taking place in other countries, what it means. Maybe it's your carbon footprint as well, right? And what are the repercussions if you have too large of one? And just understanding how that's going to come to influence us in our country as well, right? It's already happening. It's already in discussions in states like Washington State, Oregon, right? They're already talking about that carbon footprint thing. So people need to understand that. And if they haven't, take a look at what's took place in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and if they can, visit Aman Javi's Facebook page. Understanding specifically the abilities for your phone and devices. I'm not saying he's a hero, but there's a lot of good, and I'm not even saying he's correct. I'm not confirming what he said as being valid, but the whole Snowden thing, right? And understanding some of the technologies that he refers to that he sees an issue, go and check out what that is. And again, not to watch, fear-mongering movies, but just to understand that what's in the realm of possible. I think that may be a good idea. And then in addition to like, the self-sufficient life and how to live it, the book I talked about skills, maybe having a book on either natural remedies or a hard copy book, as a prepper, anything of value that you may lose if you lose access to your devices, to the internet, to social media, whatever it is, you want to make sure you have a hard copy of it, right? So one of those things, of course, is the Bible, and some practical books, maybe edible plants in your region, right? In part of the country, we have one from Missouri that's awesome. You might want to take a look at Roger Ayers' Live Not by Lies, because that book came out, I think, right at the beginning of COVID, and it was such an eye opener to read it because it helped to put things in perspective about what was taking place, and to an extent spiritually, but historically as well, and practically, to understand how people handled crisis in Eastern Europe or in Russia. He references Alexander Solzhenitsyn a lot. So I highly recommend having a copy of that book on hand to help you. It's almost like it's a reference guide to the things that you really need to know and understand to contemplate the world. We also get another little thing I'll just say is Imprimis, and that's from Hillsdale College. They put out some really good, concise explanation of what's taking place. If you want to read something from someone who's a subject matter expert, but with the right mindset, oftentimes, I think Hillsdale offers a great free resource, and they send them out printed copies if you want to keep copies of them as a reference in the future you can. So those are just a couple of things I wanted to bring up practically. So I think that's most of the items I wanted to cover, Buck.
Yeah, this has been amazing. I have just kind of a general, well, maybe a specific. Let me ask this to you. In your opinion, who's considered more of an enemy of the state at this point? Someone in, let's say, Antifa, or let's say someone who is a member of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia?
That's a loaded question. The answer is, it depends. How's that?
There you go. Okay.
It depends where you stand, right? So if you're opposed to, clearly, if your family members are getting, killed, in Ukraine, you can't justify what Russians are doing, right? And you will not side with what the Russian Orthodox Church is saying. War is horrible. War is terrible. There's atrocities committed by both sides, right? So it's not like one is guiltless and the other's not. And Antifa, I'm pretty sure they're considered a domestic terrorist organization, which I completely believe they are.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the difference, say, between the truckers, the Freedom Convoy truckers you saw, versus Antifa and what they did over their protest was violence and destruction. Right? We didn't see truckers burning buildings down. We didn't see truckers, flipping cars over. We didn't see them destroying businesses. But we kind of did see that with Antifa. So, if anyone's keeping score, that may help.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
What would you like to plug?
Well, I'd like to plug my book. I'm, recently a discoverer of your podcast here. And I encourage people to check out the other ones that you have. You have some great insights into what's taking place with the war in Ukraine, the origins of the war. I recommend they take a look at those podcasts that you have. I guess I've kind of talked at those issues that I'm concerned with, that I'm writing about in the book, that have been occupying my time recently. So
I know this can be taboo for an author, but do you have a date that you at least want it to be out?
So there are a couple publishers looking at it right now. And I'm pretty determined to get the thing published. I'm hoping, I'm putting it in God's hands. It's God's will, who's going to publish it. And my prepping journey has been a really interesting one, especially over the past couple of years. I have learned that there are some really devout Catholics that do some awesome prepping, right? And I was not aware of it. And as far as I'm aware, there's no official push to go to a rural life in the Orthodox Church that I'm aware of, right? There's no push to be self-sufficient. There's no emphasis on communal living. And not that that's the solution to all our problems, but it's interesting. The Catholic Church, I think it was in the 30s and 50s, actually focused on that, right? Kind of petered out. But there are a lot of devout Catholic preppers who I think have their hearts and their minds in the right place, and they're going about doing things. So I kind of would say, open up your aperture to what's out there if you're interested in prepping. I would immediately, I would recommend immediately ignoring or just taking with a grain of salt things that you hear people when they get emotional and animated about the threats that you'll face, because it's like, that's a great way to get you spun up and get you open up your wallet, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I urge people to be very cautious about that. And I would have you talk to your spiritual father or whoever your mentor is, right? Your spiritual mentor, to get some insights into their perspective of it, right? I have met and talking to some really smart people that have some great skills. There's some people who are opposed to prepping, right? And they're devout Christians, and they're just opposed to it because they want to leave it to God. Well, my answer to that is, hey, I got car insurance. You got car insurance? Hey, I've got health insurance. You got health insurance? I don't worry about it, but I'm practical about it. And sometimes it's even required by law. So, and again, so I don't know. I guess that's something else I wanted to bring up. As far as how you approach it, right? Not in fear, but in faith and love, right? That's how we're supposed to be approaching prepping. So I hope that that's been helpful to people who have kind of, their eyes have been open with what's been taking place, in our country and internationally recently. And if you're concerned about it, really pray about it, talk to your priest about it. And you might be surprised to find there's other people in your community who are thinking along the same lines you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe your priest has even been thinking about it, maybe hearing the rest, and maybe he'll do what happened in our church. Father Turbo had the insight to say, okay, there's a lot of people concerned about these things, right? Let's take a balanced approach to it. Let's, pray about it. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to task, this group of individuals to go do some research on this aspect of it. I'll task somebody to do some research on this aspect of it. And he gave us a few weeks to do research and come back in groups with what our findings were with recommendations. And he emphasized, not just the community perspective, like what does the community need to do, right? We've got nuns in our church. What would they need to do if there was a cyber attack on our infrastructure and we lost power in the middle of winter, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which are fetched because we had a missile lane in Poland not that long ago, which almost set off NATO's getting pulled into what's taking place in Ukraine. And so, okay, if that's going to happen, Russia's already promised they're going to go after our infrastructure if we get into the war to that extent. So he says, think about what the nuns need, think about what the church needs, but also think about what your family has. So we had to go out and do research from a community perspective as well as an individual family's perspective, come back with recommendations. So that was very insightful. And I think I'm going to have permission to publish some of the results of that in my book as well.
Excellent.
Kind of as an appendix at the end. So
yes.
Yeah.
That's a very good, very, very good idea. I like that. Priests listening, I know there's some. I think that's an excellent idea for y'all's churches or even my church. Alex Braszko, two things. You're the only guest that's ever had a slideshow on here, so that was a first. I enjoyed it.
That's a military requirement. We've been
I like it. Yeah. Until I became an officer in the fire department, I had never created a PowerPoint in my entire life. Now I've made one, a few. And then you're the only guest who's ever, when I asked for plugs, you plugged my show. So that was very humble. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you,
You
bud.
got it. Thanks, Alex. I hope you guys gained a lot from this episode. I think you did. I think you will. It's a lot to chew on, a lot to think about. And it's one of those I'm going to watch and listen to a few times because there's a lot of information packed in this. So thank y'all so much for supporting the show, for listening, for being there, for sending direct messages, emails, all of that. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. Appreciate the love, the support, and even the harassment from time to time. Until next week, you guys have a good one. See ya.
You get split in fucking half, till I call the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.